World War II saw a technological revolution, especially in aviation. By the time the United States entered the war in 1941, both the Axis and Allied powers were using highly advanced fighter aircraft that could turn the tide of battle in the skies. Among these, the Japanese Zero stood out as one of the most feared and agile fighters. Its design, which prioritized maneuverability and speed, made it a formidable adversary against any opponent. Yet, this very strength became the reason for a new strategy that would revolutionize aerial combat and would eventually help Allied forces overcome the Zero's dominance. Before this shift in tactics, fighter pilots in the Pacific were primarily trained to engage in dogfights at eye level. They would lock in on their target and engage in a maneuvering contest trying to outturn the enemy and get into position to fire. The standard tactics were essentially vertical and horizontal movements, where pilots would dive, climb, or roll to outmaneuver the enemy. It was the strategy of choice for a generation of pilots trained in the art of dogfighting. But the Japanese Zero, with its unmatched agility and near unbeatable turning radius, was beginning to show its superiority in these traditional engagements. Pilots faced with the Zero had to confront its unique strengths. The Zero's lightweight design allowed it to turn in the smallest radius possible, making it an ideal weapon for close-quarters combat. Its devastating firepower, coupled with its agility, gave Japanese pilots a huge advantage in a dogfight. It was clear that a new tactic would be required to overcome this growing threat in the skies. This led to the development of a daring and unconventional method of attack, flying upside down. The first pilots to adopt this method weren't necessarily looking for a drastic change in tactics. In fact, it came from the desperation of survival. The reality of air combat over the Pacific during World War II was brutal. Fewer than half of the men who flew into combat would return. The Zero's success in the skies was a direct result of its superior speed and agility. The Americans and other Allied pilots needed to find a way to level the playing field. And they found their answer not in conventional horizontal or vertical attacks, but by turning the tables literally by flying upside down. Initially, the idea of flying upside down in combat was dismissed as crazy. However, it soon became clear that this unorthodox method of flying could neutralize some of the Zero's advantages. It was the perfect countermeasure, one that would allow the pilots to maintain the upper hand in combat and take the fight to the enemy on their own terms. The idea of an upside-down approach didn't come from a single pilot, but rather a collective evolution of aerial tactics. It was born out of the necessity for a counter-strategy to deal with the Japanese Zero's performance in close-range dogfights. As pilots engaged in combat with these agile aircraft, many began to notice that the Zeros were consistently winning dogfights due to their superior maneuverability. The turning point came during engagements like the Battle of Midway in 1942. Fighter pilots, both American and Japanese, engaged in a relentless back and forth, where the focus shifted to trying to get into the Zero's vulnerable spots without getting caught in its rapid turns. The problem, however, was that the Zeros were skilled at drawing their pursuers into a tight turning circle where they could quickly dispatch their prey with well-placed gunfire. One of the key observations made by American pilots was that the Zeros would sometimes expose their weaknesses while executing these tight turns. The Japanese aircraft's limited speed in a sustained dive and the moments when they had to readjust for another turn gave the Allied pilots a window of opportunity to strike. But they had to break away from the standard attack patterns. By the summer of 1942, a few pilots started to experiment with a novel method. Instead of turning and diving, they would fly inverted, literally flying upside down to exploit the Zero's own turns. This new method gave the pilots the advantage of maintaining control of their speed while keeping the Zero in their sights. Flying upside down allowed Allied pilots to avoid being caught in the tight turning radius of the Zero. More importantly, by flying inverted, the American pilots could now make attacks at unexpected angles. It was an ambush, one that the Zero pilots couldn't easily counter. The technique initially required a great deal of skill and mental focus. For an American pilot, maintaining control of their aircraft while flying upside down at high speeds was no easy feat. But necessity breeds invention, and as these pilots began to refine the maneuver, it became clear that they had stumbled upon something revolutionary. While the upside-down tactic had immediate benefits, it was not without its challenges. Flying inverted at such high speeds created an entirely new set of difficulties. For one, the controls of the fighter aircraft were not designed to handle inverted maneuvers at full throttle. Pilots would often find themselves struggling with the rudder and aileron responses, which required expert knowledge and skill to manage. In addition to the physical difficulty of flying upside down, pilots also had to contend with the psychological strain. The constant maneuvering and unpredictable nature of inverted combat added a layer of mental fatigue that was difficult to manage. In a high-stakes environment, where pilots were already under tremendous pressure to perform, the added complexity of flying upside down only heightened the risk. But as more pilots experimented with the tactic and began to adapt their skills, it became apparent that the benefits far outweighed the challenges. Flying upside down allowed pilots to anticipate enemy movements better and, most importantly, gave them an edge in the dogfights where conventional tactics had failed. The first documented instance of the upside-down tactic in large-scale combat occurred during the Battle of the Coral Sea in 1942. The battle, which marked a turning point in the Pacific theater, saw the first carrier-based fighter combat between American and Japanese forces. It was in this battle that the concept of flying upside down and ambushing the Zeros started to be refined and applied systematically. The American pilots, flying the F-4F Wildcat, found success by using the upside-down maneuver to get inside the Zero's turn. By flying inverted, they could dive directly into the path of an oncoming enemy, firing from a more advantageous position. The unexpected nature of the attack, coupled with the Zero's weakness during tight turns, allowed American pilots to achieve victory in several engagements. The result of this tactic was nothing short of a revelation. It not only reduced the number of losses among American pilots, but also significantly lowered the effectiveness of the Zero in subsequent dogfights. Pilots who had been previously outclassed by the Zero's agility began to engage with a newfound confidence. The tide was turning in favor of the Allies, and it was largely due to this unconventional maneuver. As the fighting in the Pacific intensified, Allied pilots realized that the upside-down maneuver was not just a temporary trick, it was becoming a critical part of their arsenal. What started as a desperate, instinctive countermeasure soon evolved into a highly effective tactic that could be reproduced and refined in every theater of operations. But this was no easy feat. Pilots needed to adapt their training, aircraft handling, and mental focus to fully integrate the upside-down tactic into their dogfighting strategies. The first key to mastering the upside-down maneuver was training. Unlike traditional dogfighting, which focused on vertical and horizontal maneuvers, the upside-down tactic required pilots to fly in an entirely new way. Instead of focusing on the usual range of high-speed rolls and loops, pilots had to learn how to control their aircraft when inverted and understand the differences in handling when flying upside down. Pilots began by practicing the inverted maneuver in training environments, where they could familiarize themselves with the handling and challenges of flying upside down. The initial approach was relatively simple. Pilots would flip their aircraft upside down at high speeds, and then perform standard combat maneuvers like diving, climbing, and rolling, all while remaining inverted. However, while the mechanics of the maneuver were relatively straightforward, the real challenge came in the mental and physiological aspects. Flying upside down was taxing on a pilot's body, as it forced them to work against their natural senses. In a high-pressure combat environment, being inverted often caused disorientation, and pilots had to rewire their brains to adjust to these new orientations. The physical strain of blood pooling in the head and the challenge of maintaining focus while under attack made inverted combat even more stressful. It was clear that only the most skilled and dedicated pilots would be able to fully harness the benefits of this new tactic. Among the first pilots to embrace and master the upside-down tactic were a select few who were willing to push the limits of conventional combat. Pilots like Lieutenant Colonel Marion Carl and Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington, two of the most decorated Marine Corps aviators, were among the first to experiment with this method in their encounters with the Japanese Zero. Pappy Boyington, in particular, was known for his bold and unorthodox style of fighting. As the commander of the VMF 214 Black Sheep Squadron, Boynton had earned a reputation as a daring and aggressive pilot. He quickly adopted the upside-down tactic and began using it with increasing success in his engagements against the Zeros. Boynton's ability to blend this new tactic with his natural skill made him one of the most feared pilots of the war. One of the key moments that helped solidify the effectiveness of the technique came during a series of battles in the Solomon Islands, where Boynton and his squadron began flying upside down to engage the Zeros from unexpected angles. By performing these inverted attacks, Boynton and his pilots were able to disrupt the usual Zeros' tactics, creating confusion among their opponents. The success of the upside-down tactic didn't just come from surprise, it also had a scientific and tactical foundation. By flying inverted, pilots could exploit the Zero's weakness in tight turns. The Zero, known for its unparalleled agility, was often forced into an extremely sharp turn to stay on target with a pursuing enemy. However, when pilots employed the upside-down maneuver, they were able to maintain more control over their speed and trajectory. This allowed them to avoid the deadly tight turning circle that Zeros thrived in. Additionally, the inverted approach allowed Allied pilots to maintain a superior position by flying directly into the Zero's turn rather than chasing it. This not only negated the Zeros' agility, but also enabled the Allied pilots to attack from angles that the Japanese fighters had difficulty countering. The tactical advantage of the upside-down maneuver was also enhanced by the psychological impact it had on enemy pilots. The Zeros, which were accustomed to engaging in close-range dogfights at eye level, found themselves confronted by an entirely new and unexpected threat. Allied pilots, flying inverted, could take advantage of any disorientation or hesitation the enemy experienced when facing a maneuver that was so unconventional. By 1943, the upside-down tactic had become a standardized method among Allied fighter pilots. What began as an innovation by a few experienced pilots had now become a common strategy taught in naval aviation schools and incorporated into the training of fighter squadrons. The maneuver was particularly effective in the Pacific, where American pilots were facing the formidable Zeros on a daily basis. The transition from a last-ditch, untested maneuver to a reliable combat strategy took time. It required the collective knowledge and experience of the Allied air forces to refine the technique and share the lessons learned from the battles. Over time, the upside-down maneuver was not only used by individual pilots, but became part of standard fighter tactics, with fighter pilots practicing it alongside more traditional dogfighting methods. The innovation's success reached its peak during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where the Allies decisively defeated the Japanese in one of the largest air battles of the war. By this point, the upside-down tactic had evolved into a primary method of ambushing Japanese fighters. As the Zeros and their pilots grew more desperate in their attempts to maintain air superiority, the Americans used their upside-down approach with lethal precision, further cementing its place in the history of aerial warfare. The success of the upside-down flying tactic in the Pacific wasn't just confined to the battlefields over the Solomon Islands or the Philippines. It had far-reaching consequences for the broader air combat strategies of the Allied forces. As the war moved across Europe and the Mediterranean, many of the lessons learned from Pacific dogfighting were adapted to counter-Axis aircraft, such as the German Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf Fw-190. The principles of the inverted maneuver, particularly the ability to maintain control of speed and positioning during tight engagements, became key aspects of training for Allied fighter pilots worldwide. While the specific upside-down maneuver wasn't always applicable in every theater, the core concepts were integrated into the training of fighter pilots across Europe, North Africa, and beyond. As the war progressed, the upside-down maneuver became more than just a localized tactic used by a handful of pilots. It evolved into a core part of Allied aerial doctrine. Initially seen as a desperate response to the unparalleled maneuverability of the Japanese Zero, the technique now represented a new era of tactical thinking in air combat. With its success over the Pacific, the maneuver began to spread throughout different Allied forces. From the U.S. Navy to the Royal Air Force, changing how fighter pilots approached combat in the skies. But how did this crazy maneuver evolve and get standardized across so many different theaters of the war? The flexibility of the upside-down maneuver made it an invaluable tool in a variety of air combat scenarios. The versatility of the technique was one of its key strengths. It was adaptable and could be employed in a range of situations, from high-speed dogfights to more controlled tactical engagements. But the nature of aerial combat varied greatly, depending on the region, the enemy aircraft, and the combat environment. In the Pacific, Allied pilots primarily used the maneuver against the agile Japanese Zeros. These aircraft were designed for maximum agility at high speeds and in tight turns, which posed a major threat to Allied fighters. The upside-down maneuver gave Allied pilots a way to get the drop on these fighters, turning the Zero's own advantages into a disadvantage. By 1943, the maneuver had been perfected by many pilots, and it was becoming more common among the U.S. Navy's carrier-based fighter squadrons. However, as the war expanded and Allied forces moved into Europe and North Africa, the enemies changed. The German Luftwaffe, with its Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf Fu-190, brought a new set of challenges. These aircraft were not as agile as the Japanese Zeros, but they were highly effective in sustained turns and had superior firepower. Despite these differences, the upside-down maneuvers still proved useful in European air combat. In the case of the Bf-109, which was known for its ability to engage in tight turns while maintaining energy, the upside-down tactic gave Allied pilots the edge in the initial moments of the engagement. By flying inverted, they could disrupt the German pilots' typical dogfighting tactics and get into a favorable position quickly. The same applied to the F-190, which was a formidable adversary in close combat. The upside-down approach gave Allied pilots the ability to avoid getting drawn into tight-turn fights, and instead, they could attack from angles that the German fighters struggled to counter. This adaptation across different theaters of the war demonstrated the maneuver's utility beyond the Pacific. It wasn't just a technique for confronting the Japanese, it was becoming an essential tool in the toolbox of every Allied fighter pilot. By 1944, the upside-down flying technique had moved beyond just being a unique tactic to becoming an integrated part of standard training for Allied fighter pilots. The technique was taught not only in specialized air combat schools, but also became a core part of aerial tactics in fighter squadrons across the U.S. and other Allied air forces. The technique was incorporated into dogfighting drills, often performed alongside traditional combat maneuvers, such as loops, rolls, and climbs. The training of the pilots was particularly intense. These pilots needed to not only perform the technique, but also understand when to use it for maximum effect. It wasn't enough to simply execute the maneuver, it had to be strategically timed, ensuring that the pilot wasn't left exposed or vulnerable after executing the upside-down attack. This required careful consideration of speed, altitude, and the relative positions of enemy aircraft. Pilots were taught to identify the moment when the enemy would be most vulnerable during turns, climbs, or even while trying to evade a pursuing aircraft. The trick was to engage in a surprise attack, with the pilot entering the enemy's turning circle from above or below, making use of the inverted approach to fire without giving the enemy time to react. By the time the Allied forces prepared for their invasion of Normandy, the upside-down tactic had been fully incorporated into the standard tactics used by fighter pilots, from the Pacific to the European front. The training was so successful that, by D-Day in 1944, American pilots were regularly flying the maneuver in combat against German and Japanese aircraft. While the upside-down maneuver had clear tactical advantages, it also had a psychological impact on both the pilots who used it and the enemy they faced. For Allied pilots, the maneuver gave them a sense of empowerment. They knew they had a new tool in their arsenal, one that could give them the upper hand in a combat environment that was as unpredictable as it was dangerous. For the Japanese and German pilots, however, the sight of an Allied fighter approaching them from an unexpected angle, upside down and with guns blazing, was disorienting and intimidating. It shook their confidence and disrupted the traditional flow of combat. The psychological impact of the maneuver was just as important as its tactical benefits. The upside-down attack became synonymous with innovation, fearlessness, and the willingness to turn the tables on the enemy. As a result, The technique became part of a broader shift in aerial combat psychology. It was a sign that the Allies were no longer on the defensive. They were outthinking and outmaneuvering their opponents. This shift in mindset was crucial for maintaining morale and driving forward the Allied war effort. In many ways, the maneuver was symbolic of the Allied forces' ability to adapt, innovate, and most importantly, survive. The impact of the upside-down maneuver extended far beyond World War II. In the post-war years, as fighter aircraft evolved and jet engines became more common, the core principles of the upside-down technique were incorporated into the training programs for new generations of pilots. The concept of exploiting an opponent's blind spots, gaining unexpected angles of attack, and using energy management to stay ahead of the enemy would remain central to aerial combat strategy well into the era of jet fighters. In particular, the techniques developed during World War II influenced the way pilots would engage in future air combat, including during the Cold War and the Korean War. The notion of using unconventional tactics to gain the upper hand against superior enemies would become a hallmark of modern aerial combat. Furthermore, the lessons learned from the upside-down maneuver helped shape the development of more advanced flight training programs that focused not just on the basics of flight, but also on the ability to think creatively and adapt to the pre-percent challenges of combat. In many ways, the upside-down flying technique was a precursor to the complex maneuvers that would later define dogfighting in the jet age. The upside-down maneuver was one of the most innovative strategies to come out of World War II, and its influence on air combat extends far beyond the Pacific and European theaters. What began as a desperate countermeasure to the Japanese Zero's agility has now evolved into a foundational principle in modern aerial combat. Even in the age of advanced jet fighters, stealth technology, and drone warfare, the core lessons learned from the upside-down tactic continue to shape how pilots engage.
You actually did it! To the upside down.